For decades, Linux has carried the same label everywhere it went. Whether it was whispered in tech forums, shouted in YouTube comment sections, or casually mentioned by friends who tried it once and went back to Windows or macOS. Powerful, fast, secure, endlessly customizable. But hard, or more specifically, hard for normal people. That reputation became Linux's biggest weakness, and for a very long time it was a fair criticism. Installing Linux often felt like an initiation ritual. Hardware support was a gamble. Wi-Fi might work, or it might not. Graphics drivers were a mess. You had to know what you were doing, or at least be willing to learn fast and break things along the way. And if something went wrong, the advice you got online usually sounded like, just open the terminal and compile the kernel, which might as well have been a different language entirely. That weakness shaped how Linux was perceived, how it was talked about, and why, despite running the internet, the cloud, Android, and most servers on Earth, Linux desktops remained a tiny fraction of personal computers. But something strange has been happening over the last few years. Quietly, steadily, and without a single big announcement declaring victory, Linux has been shedding that old weakness. Not all at once, not perfectly, and not without controversy, but enough that a serious question now has to be asked. Has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness, or at least weakened it enough that it no longer defines the platform? To understand why this question even matters, you have to understand just how deeply that weakness was baked into the Linux experience. Early desktop Linux distributions were built by enthusiasts for enthusiasts. Debian, Slackware, Gentoo, Arch Linux, all of them prioritized control, transparency, and philosophy over comfort. Ubuntu changed that conversation in the mid-2000s by saying Linux could be human-friendly. But even Ubuntu still assumed users were willing to tinker, troubleshoot, and Google error messages. Fedora focused on showcasing the future of Linux technologies, not necessarily making life easy for beginners. OpenSUSE offered powerful tools but also overwhelming complexity. Linux Mint made huge strides in accessibility, yet still lived in the shadow of Windows compatibility issues. The biggest problem was never that Linux was bad. It was that Linux asked too much from the user. You had to care. You had to learn. You had to accept that some software simply wasn't available, or that alternatives weren't quite the same. You had to be okay with things breaking after updates, or at least be willing to fix them yourself. For developers and power users, this was a feature. For everyone else, it was a deal breaker. Fast forward to today, and the landscape looks very different. Modern Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora Workstation, Pop!_OS, Zorin OS, Elementary OS, and even Arch Linux with guided installers now offer installation experiences that rival or beat Windows. Hardware detection is dramatically better. Wi-Fi almost always works out of the box. Bluetooth is no longer a dice roll. Printers, once Linux's greatest nemesis, are far more likely to behave thanks to improved driver support and standards like IPP everywhere. Graphics long a sore spot have improved massively. AMD GPUs work beautifully on Linux with open drivers that often outperform their Windows counterparts in stability. Intel graphics are practically flawless. NVIDIA is still complicated, but even there, things have changed. The introduction of better Wayland support, improved proprietary drivers, and even NVIDIA's gradual move toward open kernel modules has reduced friction. It's not perfect, but it's no longer the nightmare it once was. Then there's software availability, which used to be Linux's most obvious weakness to everyday users. No Microsoft Office, no Adobe Photoshop, no popular games, no mainstream creative tools. That argument used to be devastating, and now it feels outdated. Not gone, but outdated. Web apps have changed everything. Microsoft Office runs in the browser. Google Docs dominates schools and offices. Slack, Discord, Zoom, Figma, Notion, Spotify, and countless others are platform agnostic. If your workflow lives in a browser, Linux suddenly works just fine. On top of that, Linux native applications have matured. LibreOffice is far better than it used to be. Krita is a legitimate professional-grade digital painting tool. Blender is an industry powerhouse. DaVinci Resolve runs on Linux. Steam is native. VS Code treats Linux as a first-class citizen. JetBrains IDEs love Linux. For developers, Linux has arguably become the best desktop OS available. Gaming, once the ultimate checkmate against Linux, has undergone a near miraculous transformation. Valve's investment in Linux through Steam Play and Proton changed the game entirely. Suddenly, thousands of Windows games ran on Linux with little or no effort. The Steam Deck, running SteamOS based on Arch Linux, proved that Linux gaming wasn't just possible, it could be mainstream. Millions of users now interact with Linux daily without even realizing it. When a handheld console running Linux can play AA titles out of the box, it's hard to argue that Linux is inherently hostile to gamers anymore. But ease of use and software availability are only part of the story. The real shift happened when Linux stopped asking users to think like Linux users. Modern distributions hide complexity behind polished interfaces. Package managers like apt, DNF, and pacman have been complemented by universal formats like Flatpak and Snap. While controversial, Flatpak in particular has transformed app installation for regular users. You search, click install, and the app works, with dependencies bundled and sandboxed. No broken libraries, no dependency hell, no cryptic errors. For newcomers, this feels normal, and that's exactly the point. Linux desktops themselves have grown up. GNOME, once criticized for being too different, is now consistent, touch-friendly, and clean. KDE Plasma, once mocked for instability, has become one of the most polished and customizable desktops available on any platform. Cinnamon offers familiarity for Windows migrants. Cosmic Impop_OS is pushing workflow innovation. Wayland, after years of pain, is finally becoming the default, bringing smoother graphics, better security, and modern display handling. So if Linux has improved so much, why does the question still matter? Why isn't Linux dominating the desktop if its biggest weakness is gone? This is where things get complicated because the weakness may have shifted rather than disappeared. One argument is that Linux's biggest weakness was never technical, it was social. Fragmentation, tribalism, and community attitudes scared people away. RTFM culture, endless distro wars, and ideological purity tests made Linux feel unwelcoming. That hasn't entirely vanished. You can still find hostility toward beginners, arguments over system, Flatpak versus Snap flame wars, and endless debates that mean nothing to newcomers. But even here, change is happening. Large communities around Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, and Pop_OS are far more beginner-friendly than they used to be. Documentation is better. YouTube tutorials exist for everything. AI assistants can now help troubleshoot Linux issues in seconds. Another lingering weakness is hardware vendors. While things have improved, Linux still isn't always a first-class target. Some laptop features, fingerprint readers, RGB controls, and vendor-specific utilities work better on Windows. However, companies like Dell, Lenovo, and System76 now ship laptops with Linux pre-installed. Framework supports Linux openly. Valve builds hardware around Linux. That sends a powerful signal that Linux is no longer an afterthought. Then there's the elephant in the room, market inertia. Windows comes pre-installed on most PCs. People use what they're given. Changing operating systems feels risky, unnecessary, and unfamiliar. Linux can be objectively better in many ways, and still lose simply because it's different. Overcoming that kind of weakness takes time, not just better software. So has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness? If that weakness was usability, accessibility, and everyday practicality, then yes, in many ways it has. A user can install Ubuntu or Linux Mint today, use it for web browsing, office work, media consumption, coding, and even gaming, and never touch the terminal. They can update safely, install apps easily, and enjoy a stable, fast system that respects their privacy. That would have been almost unthinkable 20 years ago. But Linux has gained something else along the way, something just as important: confidence. The Linux desktop no longer feels like it's apologizing for itself. It's not trying to be Windows. It's not begging users to give it a chance. It simply exists as a valid, mature alternative. Fedora confidently pushes modern Linux tech. Ubuntu focuses on stability and enterprise backing. Arch Linux embraces minimalism and control. Linux Mint prioritizes comfort and familiarity. Each distribution knows who it's for, and that clarity makes the ecosystem stronger. At the same time, new challenges have emerged. Flatpak and Snap introduced debates about control and centralization. Wayland still has edge cases. NVIDIA support still frustrates some users. Professional creative industries remain heavily tied to proprietary software that hasn't fully embraced Linux. These are real issues, but they're no longer existential weaknesses. They're obstacles, not deal breakers. Perhaps the most telling sign that Linux has changed is how people talk about it now. The conversation has shifted from why Linux will never work on the desktop to which Linux distro should I recommend to my friend. That shift matters. It means Linux is no longer defined by what it lacks, but by what it offers. Freedom, performance, security, transparency, and choice without demanding pain as the price of entry. So maybe the better question isn't whether Linux has lost its biggest weakness, but whether that weakness still matters. In a world where most work happens in browsers, where games run through compatibility layers, where hardware support keeps improving, and where users care more about privacy and control, Linux feels more relevant than ever. It may never dominate the desktop in raw numbers, but it doesn't need to. It has already won where it counts, by becoming usable without losing its soul. Linux didn't suddenly become easy overnight. It evolved slowly and stubbornly, just like it always has. And in doing so, it may have finally left behind the one thing that held it back for so long. The idea that it wasn't ready for regular people. Today, Linux isn't asking users to adapt to it. It's adapting to them. And that might be the biggest victory of all.